All right, guys, I know I deprived you of our Friday hangs with JM here for a few weeks, but we are back in the saddle for week 17. Maybe your best ball teams did not make it, but you know what? The week 17 DFS slate is there for the taking. We got some interesting games, some incentives to talk through with these teams, injuries, all of that here on the Block Party Show with Pete and JM. Let's do it. I'm in my wrong. This is how out of practice I am. I'm in the wrong one. Let's try this again. Here we go.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto match with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, 35 bullets to your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey, everyone.
All right. Yes, I botched my own opening there because I was in the wrong StreamYard brand thing. I mean, Jim, one thing I know you've learned as a kid, as having kids in multitasking, like I've had to trim all my fat. Like I was writing an article for Fantasy Life that's going to come out tomorrow, like right up until we came on. Normally I'm like dicking around. I mean, I have no extra time now to get things ready. I'm just flying by the seat of my pants from one thing to the next.
No, my wife always says she was never more busy unnecessarily than before we had kids. She's like, what did I do with all my time? She's like, I always thought I was like, had a lot to do. And now, yeah, everything has to be precise, including apparently knowing what stream you're on. It's funny. The backdrop, I was like, oh, I like this backdrop. I didn't even know there was like a different, but yeah, here we are. We're back in the saddle, dad life ①2 now. So welcome to the club. And your brain is probably more fuzzy than normal, but you will get used to that the lack of sleep and all the fun that comes with it.
Yeah, I think this will be my first slate since having the child that I've actually get to pay closer attention to. I tried the whole thing of like, you know what? I'm not going to be, neck deep in it, but I have the new dad energy. Maybe I can just quickly build a few lineups on Sunday morning. I can tell you right now, Jam, that did not work for me the past couple of weeks.
Well, you know what? I was thinking today, I'm curious. So while you were away, I had 1 week where I finished 3rd in the Game Changer, 10th in the Slant, had a bunch of other top 5 finishes. And then another weekend that was like my worst weekend of the season. So I want you to have another kid next year so I can get a sense of like, we can build up the sample size and see what happens when you have a child, what happens with my play, because it's either really good or really bad. But yeah, and then, you could have a couple losing weekends during that stretch, and maybe I'll have some winning weekends. It'll all balance out.
I'm not falling for that, Jam, because I know you're someone who understands sample sizes. And after I have that second kid, you'd say, could we actually get up to like at least 8 or 10
we can keep
kids?
it going. I'd be fine.
I'd be fine sample size.
How big can we build the sample size?
Exactly. But yeah, still lots of big action this week on all of the sites, and kind of the last week too, before all of the incentives kind of throw things, into turmoil in week 18, where we have lots of starters sitting, all kinds of stuff like that. So maybe our last pure sweat. And of course, I am becoming a cash game grinder in week 18. Get ready to send me head to heads. But JM, macro kind of bird's eye view of this slate. I was reading what you wrote for us today in the Fantasy Life newsletter. I feel kind of par for the course for this year. We have a couple nice totals up there around the 50 range, a couple big team totals with the Chiefs and the Niners, but then otherwise a lot of ugliness beyond that.
Yeah, and there's some week 18 elements in play as well, right? We saw the Titans sit Derrick Henry and sit Malik Willis, which might have lost Malik Willis his job for their potential playoff push. But, realistically, the Jaguars are in the same position that the Titans were in. So Doug Peterson has said that those guys are going to play, but, how much will they play? Will we see a little bit of extra rest for Travis Etienne? I think one thing that went totally overlooked last week was that, Mike Johnson in the NFL Edge on OWS last week, he brought up the prospect that, look, the 49ers still want to win these games, but they probably can't get the 1 seed. They can't fall below the 3 seed. Are they going to give Christian McCaffrey 100% of the workload? And where we had seen Christian McCaffrey have a stranglehold on all the work until Jordan Mason came in as the closer, last week Tyrion Davis-Price was mixing in from early in the game. I think people really kind of overlooked that. Christian McCaffrey getting large ownership projections again this week at 9K. The Raiders have decided to bench Derek Carr. And now we just got news right before the show that Colt McCoy is out with his concussion, which another thing that throws a wrench into this slate. So, Yeah, it's a really interesting week where we have a lot of things that are pretty normal, but then a little bit of extra management to do in terms of paying attention to things and understanding what's likely to happen. We probably have Gardner Minshew starting for the Eagles, but we don't really know yet. We don't know yet if Deebo Samuel's playing or not. So, interesting week. And it's also a week, I think this is important from a macro view. It's a week in which we could literally see nobody priced above 7,500 putting up 30 points. We can talk about that more as we get deeper into the show, but everyone is so in the habit of you see so many rosters that win tournaments and they fit in several of these high-priced guys, right? The big week ahead when you were away, it was like, oh, I only see 4 players on the slate that can go for 30 points. It was Miles Sanders at 6,500, easy to fit. But the other 3 were Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase. Amon-Ra St. Brown missed that week, but my whole thing that week was, how do I fit all 4 of these guys onto as many rosters as possible, which got me Miles Sanders and Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, who were the only guys who really hit on that slate. And so we're used to seeing that type of thought process, like, oh, how can I squeeze in these high-priced guys? We're still going to see people doing that, but then maybe none of these high-priced guys hit. This is a week where mid-range salary structures are pretty interesting, and people are kind of off of that type of salary structure. So, yeah, all in all, a very interesting week. Like I said, not quite week 18, but it does have some week 18 components. And then additionally, just this really interesting setup where I don't know that any of these high-priced guys are actually going to go for 30-plus points, and yet everyone will treat them as if that's a foregone conclusion and will bias their rosters in that way.
Yeah, not to mention you already hit on the stuff with CMC. Tyreek Hill is going to have Bridgewater, fairly tough matchup against New England. Devontae Adams has Stidham. Austin Eckler got banged up at the end of that game with the knee. They don't have a lot of incentive to tax him with touches. Travis Kelce, people are always going to balk at an $8,100 price tag for a tight end, even if it's Kelce. So yeah, I'm with you. It does seem like the comfiest click up there for people is going to be Justin Jefferson. I know I've seen in the Battle Royale streets, people debating, should Justin Jefferson be going 101 or CMC be going 101? But when you factor in the prices and the concerns around all of those guys, I do wonder if by Sunday, everyone ends up coming around as Justin Jefferson being the pay up option that they feel good about.
Yeah. And let's talk about Justin Jefferson, right? I mean, the Packers are one of the toughest wide receiver matchups in the NFL. And what we look at then is we're like, okay, what has Justin Jefferson done against him? Well, week 1, he put up 42 DraftKings points, right? But the past is not always prologue, or at least the prologue doesn't always tell us exactly what's going to happen next. And so just because Jefferson put up 42 points in week 1 doesn't mean that he's going to put up 42 points again in this one. So expect the Packers, obviously the Packers who have a lot to play for, a lot to play for in their minds, right? If Seattle loses this week and Washington loses this week, and Green Bay and Detroit win, that game next week between Green Bay and Detroit is a winner take all for that last playoff spot. So Green Bay is still in the thick of things. Their whole defensive game plan is going to be, how do we force the Vikings to win with somebody other than Justin Jefferson, right? We know that the Packers already know that they're bad against the run. So it's not like, hey, let's throw everything at Dalvin Cook and try to stop him. It's going to be, how do we stop Justin Jefferson in this game? Maybe they're not successful, right? I still like Justin Jefferson this week, but if they are successful, Justin Jefferson puts up another one of these 15 to 18 pointers. And yeah, then nobody who's up at this high end really ends up paying off. So yeah, I'm very attracted to sort of mid-range structures this week, which is a very different approach for me than I normally take. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is, he's over that 7,500 threshold. He could certainly hit, but we also see a lot of 13 to 15 pointers from him. AJ Brown can certainly hit, but also has a low end to his range of outcomes. So yeah, just a really interesting week from that perspective.
Yeah, and when I did look at some projections and run optimal lineups. Amon-Ra St. Brown showing up in 100% of those. Jared Goff and Justin Fields kind of showing up as the optimal QB. So that game isn't going to be off anyone's radar. Do you see the field really gravitating here in a way where they might overstack it? Or do you think they will kind of pump the brakes on it and be like, I'll get my Fields, I'll get my Amon-Ra St. Brown, but then I'm going to get out of here and go elsewhere?
Yeah, it's hard to overstack that game, right? Because Dante Pettis has a 17-pointer. He's the only wideout other than Darnell Mooney, who's topped, I think it's like 11 DraftKings points. Darnell Mooney is a legitimate NFL wide receiver. None of these other guys are. Cole Kmet has those two 20-pointers that were matched up with Fields' 40-pointers, right? So then it's like, oh, well, when Fields hits, Kmet hits. But if we dig in deeper to the context of those, it was some long touchdowns, right? Where realistically, Komet could get the yards. He could get 13 points, and a long touchdown could go to somebody else. And then Fields ends up going for 35 to 40, but no pass catcher on the Bears ends up hitting. And then on the Lions side, they really mix and match things a lot, right? The backfield is still 3 guys mixing and matching in. And then it's Shark and Amon-Ra St. Brown every snap. And then that third wide receiver spot, Khalif Raymond is mixing in. Josh Reynolds is mixing in. They're doing a lot more 2 tight end sets now than they were doing earlier in the year. Jameson Williams is getting time on the field. So it's hard to overstack that game because it's really like you could throw Swift in there from a ceiling perspective, and then you have Swift, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Shark, and then the quarterbacks, right? And it's hard to get the Khalil Herbert's back, so the Bears backfield is split again.
Yeah.
It's hard to get excited about like overstacking that game. And yet I also look at that game as like, okay, the Lions are 5th in scoring. The Bears are second, have given up the second most points per game. The Lions have given up the most points per game. Jared Goff is so underpriced. It's laughable, right?
Yeah.
Like the only quarterbacks he's behind in passing yards is like all the Hall of Famers, right? Future Hall of Famers, like the Mahomes and it's early to say these guys are Hall of Famers, but the Mahomes and Burrows and Josh Allen, like those are the only guys with more passing yards than him. There's like 5 guys with more passing touchdowns than him. He has fewer interceptions than all those guys. Like he should be in that 6,800 to 7,100 range where they max out pocket passers, and yet he's 5,600. Early in the year, the Lions' whole offense was like, okay, let's be a run-based offense. And if the game environment dictates us opening things up, we'll open things up. As they've gotten deeper into the season, they've changed completely to a pass-centric offense. We've gone 5 straight games where they've been aggressively passing the ball, 37-plus pass attempts for Goff in all 5 of those games. That's not going to change here. And so it's like we're getting Goff at a massive discount. And then at the same time, Goff, like his ceiling is still realistically his normal range of outcomes, like 26, 27, 28, 29 points. And Fields in that type of game could go for 40, right? So I think that both these quarterbacks are really interesting. I think they're both going to be under-owned relative to how they stack up against all the other quarterbacks on this slate. And what I mean by that is they're both going to be really popular, but not as popular as they should be. And so I like both those quarterbacks, but then it's hard to figure out how to get really different with that game. The clearest way to get different is just to say, DJ Shark is like keeps being 5 yards away from the extra 3 points for the bonus. He hasn't matched up the touchdowns with the big yardage yet, and he keeps putting up 15 to 20 points, and nobody ever plays him, right? So yeah. I love Shark at 4,300, but I don't want to like box myself into Shark on every roster, right? So there's some different ways to play around with that game, but I do think it's one of those games where I look at the numbers, I say, okay, this is going to be popular, and then it's like, do I really care that much? Probably not. Right? Like Goff and Fields are still very much at the top of my list. Goff first, Fields after that. And then playing around with the different ways to put together these final 3 Lions pieces to kind of do things differently. And then I might just hope that people take some swings on Bears pass catchers and miss. I might hope that people take some swings on like Josh Reynolds, Khalif Raymond, Jamal Williams and miss. I might hope that I go overweight Shark and underweight Amon-Ra St. Brown and the points go to Shark. But yeah, it's a weird game because it's very attractive. It's going to be popular, but there aren't that many different ways that you can build it in a plus EV manner.
Yeah, Spencer's upset at us steaming up Chark. I mean, I don't know if he's going to get that steam too. I was kind of looking at stuff, and I think if people are doing double stacks, I think they'll feel almost better about tossing DeAndre Swift in at 5,300. I think Jared Goff, Amon-Ra, and DeAndre Swift will probably be the most popular Jared Goff double, and then anything off the board there if you want to play it as Jamal Williams stealing some touchdowns, and then like you said, anyone with the Bears. None of that's going to feel comfortable, like you said, which kind of makes me wonder, like, if this is the best game environment and people feel not comfortable overstacking it, maybe that is something we should lean into a little bit.
Yeah, it's just when we actually run the numbers, right? It's like, it's not like we're saying this is the best game environment, but it's only going to be 24 to 27, and so you don't want a lot of pieces. It's more like both of these teams are going to spread out those extra points in so many. Like the Bears have a 6 wide receiver rotation, right? And then they'll play 2 tight ends, and they've got 2 running backs. And then the Lions, like they've got these 2 core wide receivers, and then they just mix and match all these other running backs, tight ends, wide receivers. So it's hard to like Millie Maker, but it's kind of hard to see on tighter builds how it becomes super plus EV to have like, hey, Fields and 2 pass catchers and like 2 guys from the Lions, or Fields and even 1 pass catcher and 3 guys from the Lions. But yeah, no, I do like the idea of focusing on this game to some extent, saying, how can I get different here? One of the building blocks that I mentioned to you before the show that we won't put on the roster because it's going to be, we like doing something kind of off the board, but it'll be in the player grid is Justin Fields, DJ Shark, DeAndre Swift, which I think is just a different enough way to build that one. And then another way to look at it is just say, if this is the game that you had to have, and let's say Goff doesn't get over 20% owned and he hits, like that's still only 20% of rosters that you're competing against. And then you're going to be different enough in some other places. So yeah, I don't necessarily have to be different on this game, but I do think that with a heavier focus on Shark than the field will have, I'll be different enough for sure. And Spencer, don't worry, nobody listens to us. Nobody trusts us enough to make Shark chalk just because we're talking about him. We'll be good with
exactly. We are in our own little bubble here.
We're our own little bubble.
What are some other quarterbacks that are interesting to you on the slate? I mean, we talked about Fields and Goff. I mean, Lawrence is showing up in some optimal lineups. You of course have Mahomes if you're willing to pay up, and then you just kind of have a ton of guys in this flat tier. You know, Daniel Jones, Geno, Minshew, Rodgers, Herbert. Are there any spots here you're looking to attack? Or are you going to have, you think, a fairly narrow quarterback pool this week?
Yeah, early in the week, I was looking at quarterback and thinking, boy, there's a lot to like. And then as you go a few layers deeper and you're like, well, Goff is really underpriced. Trevor Lawrence is really underpriced. Like, what are the chances of Daniel Jones, Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady? What are the chances of these guys outscoring them? Like, they're probably lower than the field will give them credit for. So large field play, it's a broad list for me. But on tighter builds, yeah, it's basically Goff, Minshew, Trevor Lawrence, Fields, and Mahomes is really my quarterback list. I could go with a little bit of Mike White, but I think that people understate how tough Seattle has been against wide receivers. In fact, Seattle has given up one more reception to wideouts than the Jets have given up. Seattle has given up, I think it's 49 more yards to wideouts than the Jets have given up. Both of those, Seattle's third best defense against wide receiver receptions, wide receiver yards, and then I think their fifth best defense in wide receiver touchdowns. And yet everybody looks at Seattle as like, oh, bad defense, attack them, but they've been really good against wideouts this year. And then it's like, what is Mike White's ceiling if he can't really get anything going with his wideouts? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that my tighter builds are going to be Mahomes, Fields, Eagles quarterback, Lawrence, and Goff. And I want to talk about Lawrence for a moment too, because there are the same concerns that we have with the Tennessee offense, right? The Jags don't really have anything to play for here. So there's two ways to look at it. Either one, they could kind of like, I think that Lawrence is going to be out there. One of the things I pointed out this week, and you might have read this in the NFL Edge. If you probably didn't get to the NFL Edge this week because you have a new baby, but
I have not yet.
The NFL Edge, I was talking about how Trevor Lawrence, I forget the exact numbers, but it's like he had 10 touchdowns and 6 picks through like the first 8 weeks, right? And since then, he has 14 touchdowns and 1 interception. You don't improve that much that quickly. What changes is just your confidence and your mindset and your level of comfort in the offense, right? And so something shifted for this Jags team as they moved deeper into the season to where they got things rolling. They started getting momentum. They started getting confidence. And even though that's not something that we can like analytically lay out and say, okay, this team has added confidence. It's something that a coach knows, right? And so Doug Peterson, he's going to want to keep that confidence going as they roll into, because one of the things that Mike has pointed out this week on the site is the Jags essentially need to win 5 consecutive playoff games to win the Super Bowl. They have to win in week 18 and they have to win these other games, right? So one way to look at it is, hey, let's rest players. Let's get everybody healthy for the stretch run. But another way to look at it is the reason we're playing so well is because everybody's playing well together. Everybody believes, everybody's confident, everybody's in rhythm. And so you don't want to break that, but there's 2 ways that you could not break that. One way is let's go out there, let's go pass heavy. Let's do that for 2 quarters and then like sit the guys. Or it could be, let's go out there and play a full game, right? So we really don't know with Trevor Lawrence, and he's expected to be pretty popular this week, which makes it a really interesting setup. Trevor Lawrence, Travis Etienne, Zay Jones, all these guys come with higher risk, I think, than people recognize. At the same time, the ceiling's really high on these guys. So from like a risk reward standpoint, I like them in tournaments, but I also think it's important to note that risk because it's something that a lot of people will overlook this week.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too. And yeah, like when you look at, and I can pull it up on screen too, just kind of what the current optimal lineups are, you can point out a ton of risk in ways that this stuff can fail, as you mentioned, highlighted by some of the Jags stuff there. You see just even in the default, you're getting a lot of ETN, a lot of Evan Ingram, Brandon Cook showing up in that same game, and then Miles Sanders too showing up everywhere. So it does just go to show, like, maybe not a bad week to get off some of these popular plays if the field is just staring at the projections and not kind of thinking about some of the other downside risk just with team incentives.
Yeah. I mean, this is not a week with super robust chalk outside of the quarterback position, really. I see a lot of the chalk this week as being somewhat fragile. And I think, like I said, I think the standard roster construction approach will be somewhat fragile because almost every roster is going to find a way to fit in one of these higher priced pieces, whether it's Christian McCaffrey or Austin Eckler or Justin Jefferson or whoever it is, right? Most rosters that you're competing against this week will have one of these higher priced pieces. And I think that that's not particularly robust this week either. So it's a good week to we often say this, but the best way to be contrarian is not to try to be contrarian, but it's instead to just totally think for yourself. And I think if you're totally thinking for yourself this week, you end up on some roster construction approaches that are just really different from what the field is going to be on, because the field kind of follows the group think. And it's like, if the field isn't convicted in their thoughts, if an individual DFS player isn't convicted in their thoughts, then what everybody else is doing feels like it must be the right thing, right? And they don't necessarily identify it as, okay, what everybody else is doing is less robust this week than normal. It's more fragile this week than normal. And so this is a week where if you just kind of think for yourself, you're probably going to be on something different from the field, and it's going to be just as good as or better than what the field is building.
Yeah, a good example here from Nick, who I know keeps close tabs on the Panthers. He mentions that Panthers top 2 corners out, so he likes the Brady Evans play. I also have ingrained in my memory that drop touchdown pass that Evans had against the Panthers earlier this season. So yeah, it does not seem like a bad week and we just kind of talked a lot of those quarterbacks in that mid tier. It's like a flat tier as far as kind of projection and expectation, that if you do have these angles, unique angles like this, you're going to get it at a very, low ownership tag.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's just a lot of different ways that you can go, and a lot of places where I had a lot of spots in the NFL Edge this week where I said, I won't be on X spot or X players, but I also wouldn't argue with you if you were on these guys, right? And I think that this is an interesting week like that, where you said like flat projections, right? Yeah. Where it's like, hey, here are the best plays, but by this thin margin, and everybody will have heavy ownership on these guys who are best played by a thin margin. And then there's a lot of guys kind of in that same range where you tweak one little thing in the projections and these are the best guys, or these are the best guys. And so for me, I have spots that I'm picking, but then I see a lot of other spots and I'm like, these are not the spots I'm picking, but if somebody else is picking these, I think that's also sharp. Right. And so that Bucks passing attack is one of those where it's like, I'm not on it this week for my own reasons, but also if anybody's on it, I'm not going to go out of my way to be like, no, you shouldn't do that. Right. It's like, yeah, I can totally see that. There's a lot of spots like that this week. And so rather than picking I could see that spots that everybody else is on, pick I could see that spots that nobody's on. It's a great week to do that.
Let's talk about running back a little bit now. We mentioned some of the popular plays. Ramondre is going to be very popular. Miles Sanders is going to be popular. Both those guys underpriced relative to their role. I think in the lower end, it looks like Tyler Algier. We already mentioned DeAndre Swift. Maybe Zonovan Knight catches some popularity at 5,100. What is kind of your thought about the running back position? Because there really is kind of injury and team level concerns on so many of these plays.
Yeah. Ramondre is interesting to me. I like Ramondre a lot, but he has put up 3 games all season, north of 23 points. James Conner has put up 3 games in his last 5, I think it is, north of 23 points. So I don't necessarily get the fascination with Ramondre over James Conner. Obviously, this is before we knew that David Blah would be starting this week. But against Atlanta, I don't know how much that changes, right? Blah is still going to toss the ball short areas of the field. He's still going to hand the ball off to James Conner. So James Conner is an interesting option to me this week. Dalvin Cook is a very interesting option to me this week against this Packers run defense, where especially if everybody's playing Justin Jefferson, we get some leverage off of that. I'm not going above 7,500 at running back this week. I'm not going above 7,200 at running back this week. I like Ramondre. I like Etienne, but again, we have the question marks on Etienne. Miles Sanders is funny because I spent so long banging the drum on Miles Sanders and getting him at 5% ownership, 8% ownership. That week he put up, it was week 14, he put up 31.5 points. And I was sitting there with like 5% ownership from the field. And I had like 40% Miles Sanders on my rosters that week. And then all of a sudden after that week, everybody jumped on the Miles Sanders bandwagon, and he's had 2 of his worst games of the season. So yeah, I'm curious to see like how heavily people want to trust Miles Sanders. I always like Miles Sanders, but one of the things that we always talk about is if a player is volatile, that's generally the type of player where you don't want to try to predict what will happen. Instead, you just say, are they popular? I won't play them. Are they unpopular? I'll look at, and if it's a good matchup, I will play them. So Miles Sanders, just because he's so volatile, he's the kind of guy I'm totally comfortable not playing. All of his big games this year were 2 touchdown games. So you're basically, if he's chalky, you're basically riding chalk, hoping for a 2 touchdown game, which he can hit it. Like the fact that he's chalky, he doesn't know that. The Eagles don't know that. The Saints don't know that. It doesn't change his outcome, but just in terms of like what gives you your clearest path to first place, he's a guy I'm likelier to fade this week than to play heavily. But like in a vacuum outside of ownership, he's a guy I like a lot this week. AJ Dillon becomes interesting if Aaron Jones is going to be banged up. And then, yeah, when we get below there, like, can these other guys really get you 30 points? No, like Miles Sanders can get you 30 points. Jerick McKinnon can get you 30 points. ETN can get you 30 points. Ramondre and Connor haven't done it yet this year, but they can get you 30 points. And then you get down to like, you spend a little bit less and you're down at like Tyler Algier, Zonovan Knight. Like these guys can't get you 30 points. They can get you 20, 22, 25 points if everything comes together. So Brian Robinson's another guy that'll probably gain a little bit of steam this week.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I'm less interested in these super cheap guys outside of DeAndre Swift, where you're basically placing like a game environment bet and saying, look, DeAndre Swift can get you 30. We know that. What if he ends up getting 9 targets, which he's done multiple times recently, 8 to 9 targets, and then gets like 10 to 12 touches and actually gets the touchdowns or breaks off some of these big plays. So DeAndre Swift is the most interesting guy to me down here. These other guys aren't guys that I would argue against, but I also just see like a clearer path to a monster score going a few other places. So it's kind of like you play one of these guys, you need them to get 20, and you need the higher price guys to not hit for their big games, which is totally fine, but it's not the direction I'm going this week.
Yeah. We mentioned kind of how Seattle has a sneaky good pass defense. Obviously everyone knows about the Jets pass defense. What do you think about the 2 running backs in that game, Kenneth Walker and then Zonovan Knight?
So Zonovan Knight, I mean, he played 30 out of 63 snaps last week. He's basically, maybe that was 2 weeks ago. Last week he played even fewer. He's not even in a 50% role right now. I mean, obviously there were some game flow like things to worry about there, but he's essentially a yardage and touchdown back. He's a first and second down back who's going to get 1 to 2 to 3 catches, but they're going to be dump off passes. They're not going to be schemed passes that give him an opportunity to get, when Ramondre Stevenson had this big pass game role, which has randomly and inexplicably dried up. Shout out to Matt Patricia there. Side note, my wife loves Matt Patricia because she thinks he looks fun and cute, but he's also the stone cold worst coach in the NFL, regardless of whether he's what.
I'm just trying to unpack this for you, why? Because Matt Patricia kind of looks like you, GM, if you really let yourself go.
If I really let myself go, maybe that's what she's waiting for.
That's what she's trying to say.
And then there was the time where he wore the Roger Goodell clown face shirt getting off the plane. She liked that. She thought that was funny. No, she wants to she has a shelf where people who she thinks are sweet and kind, she wants to put them on her shelf. And Matt Patricia, she'd love to have him on her shelf, which I would be fine if he were there, because then he wouldn't be coaching the Patriots in any way. But yeah, Ramondre Stevenson, when he was getting this bigger pass catching role, like it was these schemed screen looks and like even some wheel routes and stuff like that where there's legitimate upside. Zonovan Knight, it's more like you catch 3 passes for 15 yards, right? The Ezekiel Elliott type of pass game role. So yeah, like Zonovan Knight, you need him to get 2 touchdowns, and he still probably only gets you like 22 points. It's hard to see him really separating your roster from the field. That's not to say he can't get you 20 points and provide value for a roster, but still, like, you're taking away a roster spot that could be used on a guy with a higher ceiling. So yeah, I don't want it to sound like I'm talking down any of these guys, because I think that these these cheaper guys are perfectly fine plays. I actually have some interest in Algier this week because there's some fun ways you could play him. I prefer pairing him with Drake London as opposed to playing him solo. But there's some fun ways to play around with these cheaper guys. But what I really want is who can get me 30 points. And that means like, hey, I'll spend a little bit more for AJ Dillon. Maybe can't get you 30, but I'll spend a little bit more for the Miles Sanders, the Jerick McKinnon, the Travis Etienne, the Ramondre, the James Conner. Kenneth Walker, I just don't like playing players against the Jets defense, but he's explosive enough that I wouldn't argue against it. I just see that game being Vegas is implying score of like 22-20 in that one, which is pretty reasonable for what we should expect. If it breaks out of that, that'll be kind of a surprise. So nothing from that game like leaps off the page to me. And I think that there's just these few game environments really stand out a lot more than some of the others. And so why do I want to go to this one when other people are going there if I can instead go to the game environments that have a much higher ceiling?
Yeah. And speaking of that, for, wide receiver, we talked about some of the really high end guys not being in the best spots or being, very expensive. Where are you at on the wide receiver position? We have a pretty big mid-range here, a handful of guys or 10, 15 guys that can get you, 20 points, but maybe not those 30-point weeks that, we're chasing here. What's kind of your macro take on the wide receivers this week?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So I guess we start at the top, right? Justin Jefferson gets 30 points on average, like more than once every other game. So he's very much in the mix, right? But if we just paint a scenario where the Patriots gave up 31.9 points, I think it was, to Justin Jefferson. And other than that, they've held every wide receiver to kind of like this 20 to 25 point range, 28 points to T. Higgins, but they held Jamar Chase and Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Adams, and they faced a lot of top wide receivers, Garrett Wilson, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, all to kind of like 20 points, 15 points. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown had a single-digit game against them. So if Tyreek Hill with Teddy Bridgewater doesn't hit, if Devontae Adams with Jarrett Stidham doesn't hit, we'll skip over A.J. Brown because he's kind of a different discussion. If Amon-Ra St. Brown doesn't hit, well, all of a sudden, the 25 pointers become really valuable, right? And so then you look down here and it's like, Jerry Jeudy can go for 30 points. Doesn't he have a 30-pointer on the season? He has a 33-pointer on the season, right? He can do that. Christian Kirk has a 30-pointer on the season. Christian Watson has a 30-pointer on the season. Amari Cooper has a 30-pointer on the season. DJ Moore has a 30-pointer on the season. Juju has a 28-pointer on the season. So like all of these guys are going to be less consistent on that, but all of these guys can technically get you there. Now that's not to speak to like the matchups or game environments for those individual players. I'm just saying like there are guys down here capable of getting you 30, just less frequently than the other guys. But if we think that those other guys, the expensive guys, are less likely than normal to get to 30, well, then one of these guys getting 20 has a lot of value and they could get you 30. So yeah, I kind of see this mid-range, kind of like from Drake London all the way up to Jerry Jeudy as like a really interesting range of wideouts. You could even throw Mike Evans in there. It's like a really interesting range of wideouts to consider. And I wouldn't mind loading up, on that range. And I also, like I'm still working through this because it was right before we got on air that you told me about Colt McCoy not starting. I still honestly might consider like a Greg Dortch on 100% of rosters rule, because David Blah is just going to throw the ball to the short areas of the field. Greg Dortch is going to be open in the short areas of the field, and he's going to have low ownership, right? Because people are already like, why wasn't he playing for those 2 weeks when he was healthy and active? And then now he has, basically like a fourth string of practice squad quarterback. So just the fact that he's had 5 high usage games this year, he's scored 13 plus points in all of those, 15 plus points in 4 of those 5 games, 22 plus points in 2 of those 5 games. Like the fact that he's down here at 3K and low ownership, I just think that there's a lot of value in that spot. So it's almost like a war of attrition this week, right? It's like, can you avoid the landmines that everybody else is on and then get those like solid scores, the 20 to 25 pointers? Yeah. And if there is like one of these higher priced guys who goes for 30, can you get the right one? And that's kind of what I see this week as is like, first and foremost, I want to make sure that I'm identifying all the landmines and avoiding them. I had my really bad week when you were on baby duty, it was a week where there were all these landmines and I missed all of them and then stepped on a bunch of others, like low-owned landmines, where it's like you feel great because you missed out on all these popular landmines and then you're like, great, I still didn't get any points myself. But it's a week like that where if you can miss the popular landmines and then get on the guys who actually get some solid scores, like you just soar past everybody. It's one of those weeks where, maybe you win with like a score of 185 in a tournament with like 5,000 entries. And it's just because like everybody else was on these higher price pieces that missed and you were on some pieces that hit for solid scores.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the Chiefs in a second, spoiler alert, when we build a lineup. But the other team with a big team total this week that isn't, necessarily going to be pushed is the Niners. We talked a little bit about at CMC at the top. I'm curious how you're thinking about the rest of this team. Where are these points going to come from? Maybe they get Deebo Samuel back. Brandon Ayuk projecting decently. And then, of course, George Kittle been scorching the earth these past couple of weeks. How are you approaching the Niners here?
Okay, so last 3 games, Brock Purdy's pass attempts, 21, 26, 22. They're playing the 49. I mean, they're playing the Raiders, who are starting basically a guy who shouldn't be an NFL quarterback in Jarrett Stidham. Granted, we sometimes see these Jarrett Stidham type guys like really pop in one start, right? And then the league gets some tape on them and then they end up getting crushed from that point forward. I don't expect that to happen against the 49ers defense, but just to say, hey, maybe randomly the Raiders keep this competitive. But we know, I mean, we took an under on Jimmy Garoppolo pass attempts earlier this year of, I think it was 30.5 pass attempts. And the numbers I laid out was like 12 of the 49ers previous 14 wins. He'd been under that mark, right? It's like when they win a game, they're going to throw the ball in the 20s, sometimes in the teens. And that's not changing because Brock Purdy, a 7th round rookie, is under center. And so they want to run the ball. And then if their running back is priced at $9K and then maybe not getting all the work, it's just hard to see where the ceiling comes from at the attached price tags. Deebo at $6K, Ayuk in the $6Ks. If Deebo is out, Mike had this interesting stat last week that in the previous 7 games where Deebo was out or limited, Kittle was averaging, I think it was 21.4 DraftKings points per game. And then he came out and had another huge game last week, right? And so like that's 8 games now where Kittle's averaging well over 22 DraftKings points per game when Deebo's out or limited. So that makes it very interesting, right? Because Kittle can do this on 6, 7, 8 targets. But yeah, I just don't see heavy enough volume from the passing attack to go there. And then I see the backfield being a thing of like, yeah, McCaffrey's going to have a good game, but is he going to get 25 to 30 touches, right? It's hard for me to see that. And so it's hard for me to see him really paying off his price tag. And if he gets you 18 to 22 points, really, you're probably not even complaining that much. You're like, okay, nice, I got a solid game, but I'm not going to be complaining about missing out on that. And that's not going to win anybody a tournament. So I don't want to talk anyone off McCaffrey, right? Because he can still score 25. He's just not a place where I'm prioritizing salary because I don't see the path to him scoring 40 points this week in a realistic scenario. And so, yeah, it's almost a spot where it's like diving into the micro of the team. They're going to pass the ball very, very little. And then the backfield is probably not going to concentrate enough touches on CMC for him to reach value at his salary, which just kind of pulls me off this team as a whole outside of the defense, which is obviously ridiculously underpriced against Jarrett Stidham this week.
I was going to say the only other angle that I was thinking through, my Galaxy brain kicked in as you were kind of laying out how you saw this spot. And I was like, could this be a backup running back for San Francisco spot, a TDP? And obviously you're not going to have that on your tight builds, but 4,400, if the whole thing is they're blowing them out of the water and they don't want to put a ton of burden on CMC, it does seem like TDP is now the second guy there who could be getting 15 touches in the second half potentially.
Yeah. And then watch Jordan Mason come out and get 15.
I know, reactive again. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I obviously like in that scenario, you're probably getting 0 catches or like 1 dump off catch. So you need like him to break off some long runs. You need a touchdown. So then you say, what's the realistic outcome, right? 100 yards, that's 13 points plus a touchdown. That's 19 points. He could theoretically get you there, right? So I don't hate that in like even in the slant, like that's the type of play that I might say 3% of my rosters in the slant, put that on there. And then the Millie Maker, I don't know what you do in the Millie Maker because I don't play the Millie Maker, but you could be like 5% in the Millie Maker just because you're trying to get like the random things that hit in the Millie Maker because only first place matters there. But no, I don't dislike that angle. There's just a heavy risk on it because we would need it to play out the way we expect, and then to pick the guy who actually gets the touches, which was Jordan Mason for multiple weeks, and then all of a sudden Tyrion Davis-Price last week. So kind of a lot of uncertainty there.
For sure. All right, it's time for everyone's favorite portion of the show where we build a lineup here on DraftKings. All right, we do have the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League. Looks like 20 more spots here. 20 more spots available as usual. It's posted in the announcement section in the Deposit Kingdom Discord. Also, a random plug for Deposit Kingdom. Going to do a special one-off show tonight at 8 p.m. A little hang on YouTube with a bunch of guys from the Discord. We can reminisce about the year. I also have a year-end highlight video that we can debut. We'll do some drafts on Underdog, have a few cocktails. Nice time. If you guys are hanging out on Friday night, feel free to swing by here again in about 5 or so hours. But JM, it's time to reveal the building block that got me excited when you floated it before the show.
Yeah. So we are going to go to this other high scoring offense outside the Lions to Kansas City. And what I wanted to do here was, so Juju, the perception around Juju is like, he has the, can you pull up, actually pull up Juju's game logs real quickly on the screen?
Yeah.
There's this perception around Juju of like, oh, he's really up and down, right? But if we scroll down, we had weeks 6 and 7, 25.3 points, 28.4 points, and a bye week, then 18.8 points. Then he got hurt against Jacksonville, right? So that low score stands out to people. But it's like, well, he only played a portion of that game. Then he missed a game, and then he came back and played limited snaps. I think he played 29 snaps against the Rams. So another low score that stands out to people of like, oh, this guy's up and down, but he's not as up and down as you would think. And then he played fewer than normal snaps against Cincinnati. And then he came back with 22.4, 17.8, 5.7. So this 5.7 against that really good wide receiver defense of Seattle is the only game where he didn't hit for like 18 plus points or 18 plus 17 plus points. So it's been 25, 28, 18, 22, 17, and then this one dud. He also had a good game against Denver last time, 22.4 points. Denver, who's going to force short area targets, middle of the field targets, where Juju works. So one of the things that I like this week is the idea of playing Mahomes, but instead of the Mahomes-Kelsey build, which I also like the Mahomes-Kelsey build, but instead of the Mahomes-Kelsey build, say, okay, another way that this could hit is Juju and McKinnon. And then that also opens things up for us to say, what's our clearest path to first place? Because we're now betting on Kelsey not hitting, which would actually be exactly what happened the last time these teams played. Last time these teams played, Juju got 22 points. McKinnon got 35 points. Mahomes had a good game. And then Kelsey had 11 points in that one. So you're basically betting on this coming out the same way it did last time. And if this happens, then you also want to take extra advantage of the Kelsey rosters missing those points. And the best way to take advantage is not to get the 3K guy who also puts up 10 points, but it's instead to find the guy who puts up like a separator score, a 20, 25 point score. So then all these Kelsey rosters that spent 8K on a tight end and got 10 points, 15 points, even 18 points, well, you're now blowing past those rosters. And so George Kittle, we're going to assume on this roster that Deebo Samuel is out this week. George Kittle becomes really interesting on a roster like this. Obviously, you could do Hawkinson, you could do Goddard, you could do whoever you want, but a tight end where you're like, hey, this guy could actually put up a huge game and blow past these Kelsey rosters down here. So this is a really interesting block where you have a clear way you're betting on this Kansas City and Denver game playing out, where Kansas City puts up points, which is likely, but they don't go through Kelsey. If they don't go through Kelsey, then Juju and McKinnon are great candidates for those points. And then you say, okay, now we're betting on Kelsey having a disappointing game. So how do we maximize the value of that? We maximize the value of that by trying to find the other big score, the big score at tight end that those Kelsey rosters are missing out on. And that would be with George Kittle on this build. So just some really interesting, basically a really interesting combination of players on this building block. Really like the way this one's set up. And that gives us kind of some tight salary, but we have this cheap 49ers defense. We have the cheap Patriots defense. We can go to either of those. Like I said, I still like Greg Dortch on any of these rosters. And if we throw those two in, we're going to see that we have a lot of salary flexibility available from there. So yeah, that's the starting point for this one. Any thoughts on your end on that, my man, Pete?
No, all of that makes a lot of sense to me. The one thing I would ask is kind of how you're thinking about the Chiefs backfield, McKinnon versus Pacheco, what their ceiling games represent in certain game flows, and whether McKinnon would get more of the Broncos hanging in there a little bit, whereas McKinnon's the guy playing more tempo for them. He's not going to be the guy necessarily salting away a 15-point lead. Is this a roster with McKinnon that would make you want to look to a Judy or a Sutton and play this as maybe a slightly more high-scoring game than the field's anticipating?
So I'll take that in two parts. First off, the Chiefs are so unique in that they are basically what the Bills were the last couple of years, right? Where then teams started playing cover 2 against the Bills, teams started playing cover 2 against Kansas City, and forced them to be like, hey, prove to us that you can run the ball rather than being so pass heavy. Whereas the Bills have basically been like, oh, okay, so now we're going to develop our run game to be a little bit more balanced so that we can throw that at teams as well. Whereas Kansas City has just said, okay, we'll still be pass centric, but we'll just change up our route tree so that we don't rely on the downfield passing as much. Kansas City is so pass-centric that they're going to run their offense deep into this game regardless of what the score is, right? And then maybe by the fourth quarter, they go a little bit more run-heavy. But also keep in mind that last time they had, I think it was a 27-0 lead against Denver, and then got a little bit too conservative and let Denver come back into that game. And Andy Reid basically chastised himself after that game for being too conservative deeper into that game. And so I never really have concerns about Kansas City taking their foot off the gas or running the ball more than expected, because if it's in a spot where the defense typically tilts teams toward the ground, Kansas City still passes the ball. If it's a spot where Kansas City has a lead, Kansas City still passes the ball. And so McKinnon, I see McKinnon as essentially the lead back, not because he's a traditional lead back, but because he's a lead back that fits best with what Kansas City does. Pacheco his usage has basically been such that he needs a 2-touchdown game in order to really go for 20 to 22 to 23 points, which really it's like, if I'm betting on a 2-touchdown game, I want it to be a guy who can separate. So I don't argue against Pacheco. I think he's a totally fine play, but he's not a guy that I've been playing. The second part of that is I don't think it's necessary to have a bring back from the Broncos, but I do see this as what Mike called a dead cat bounce game from the Broncos, right? They fired Nathaniel Hackett. Jerry Jeudy was defending Russell Wilson to the media this week. Like, I could see this as a spot where the Broncos say, hey, let's prove that if we actually put our foot on the gas and play with rhythm and tempo and don't just try to run the ball and play for the fourth quarter, we can actually put up points, right? Most teams can't score points against Denver. And so Denver's able to delude themselves into thinking that this play for the fourth quarter method will eventually work for them. Whereas this last time against Kansas City started putting up points, and then Denver was like, okay, well, we have to be aggressive now. And they got into a rhythm and actually played really well in that game. So I could very much see this being in large field play. I like Russ quite a bit this week. I could see this game being a game where the Broncos get in rhythm from the start, and basically, instead of waiting to have the opponent like push their foot down on the gas pedal for them, for the Broncos to say, hey, let's come out here and actually try to put up points for once. And if they do that, I think they can get in a rhythm and actually put up points here. A side note on that, it is interesting to note that Kansas City allowed 17.6 points per game at Arrowhead last year, which, for context, the Bills have allowed the second fewest points in the NFL this year at 17.5. This year, Kansas City has allowed, I think it's 18.7 points per game at Arrowhead, both years compared to like 23 and 25 points on the road. So they're a different defense at home. Not a great spot for Denver playing in Arrowhead, but I do still like playing around with scenarios where you say, man, maybe the Broncos get in rhythm here and put up some points. And from that standpoint, I do like Judy on this roster quite a bit.
Yeah. Real quick, before we decide if we want to do the bring back, I was just going to mention something that just how the field's been thinking about McKinnon. He, of course, had his blow-up game. Then he confirmed it for the field with another 30-point game. He was very chalky, very popular last week at 5,900, only puts up 12.8. Now he's up to 6K. Field feeling somewhat burned by him last week. I don't think we're going to see as big of field exposures on him that we've seen, in the previous two.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I kind of look at him more as like a wide receiver, right? Where if we pay $8K for a wide receiver, we're used to seeing, you can even pull up Tyreek Hill's game logs, and you'll recognize like a lot of 15-pointers mixed in with 30-pointers, right? And people aren't used to seeing that at running back as much. So when you see this at wide receiver, you don't think like, oh, this guy's inconsistent. But when you see it at running back, you think, oh, I got to stay away from this guy. And so if we flip that around and just say, like salary allocation player ceiling. Well, McKinnon, the fact that he can have these, it's 4 straight games, right? He's been like 12 to 35 points. If he puts up a 12, 15 pointer, you just recognize that's kind of in his range of outcomes, but also so are these 35 pointers. DeAndre Swift, similar type player, right? Where he hasn't hit yet, but he has basically the same usage recently as McKinnon. He can hit for a 30 pointer. He just hasn't done it. So these running backs who are really more hybrid wide receiver running backs, I like them plenty, especially on a week like this, where I like kind of want to play things differently and not necessarily, I don't necessarily think I'm missing out on a huge score from one of the more conventional running backs that everybody else is playing.
Let's wait on the bring back because I kind of want to see some other blocks or pieces.
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways we can go here for sure.
But do you want to go ahead and you mentioned Dortch and Niners? Do you want to do that just to get those in and see where that leaves us?
Yeah, and if we end up needing different, like if we have extra salary or whatever, we can use it. But I think that Dortch is still. I said it like this earlier in the week when I thought McCoy would be playing, but the opportunity to get a 3K guy who has scored 15 plus points in 4 of his 5 heavy usage games and 13 plus points in all of his heavy usage games. Like typically, if we knew for a fact that Dortch was playing 70% of the snaps and had a good quarterback under center, he would be 40% owned, 50% owned. And he would be the guy that you had to play just to kind of stick with the field and then win elsewhere. So the opportunity to get this guy as a potential separator, just because there's some uncertainty, like I'm willing to take the potential 3-pointer from Dortch for the fact that he's capable of putting up 15 to 22 points at lower than it should be ownership. And so I just really like him from like a strategy standpoint this week of like, hey, look, if I get 15 to 20 from Dortch, I'm sitting so pretty, especially at lower ownership this week. It's a spot where I'm willing to embrace some uncertainty in order to grab some extra upside.
Yeah. So where's the next direction you would like to take this lineup? As of right now, we got 3 spots, running back, wide receiver, flex, around 6K. So definitely lots of stuff we can do as far as 3 balanced players. Definitely can get in another high price stud if we want. What are you thinking?
Yeah, it's funny. So I've been doing a new show on the OWS YouTube channel. I'll do a quick plug for that show.
I was literally just about to plug that too with your nephew, right?
Yeah, with my nephew. It's been a lot of fun. DFS Lab. And the concept there is that most of these roster building shows, it's like 2 people who have a lot of experience and success in DFS. And my nephew has like gotten really into DFS in the last year. He's really sharp with like his grasp of it, but he's still learning, right? And so it's a cool show. But I've been doing that for 3 weeks now with him, and he's in the driver's seat building the lineup. So when you just said, what do you want to do here? That's like, I'm used to now asking that question. And I'm like, ooh, I don't know what I want to do here. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go Dalvin Cook. Because we're basically
Yosh is happy with that one.
Yeah, we're basically locking ourselves here into a roster where we're not going to play one of these high-priced guys. Yeah. And I like that because we've got Mahomes for the salary, like with the high spend on salary. But we basically are able to say, okay, if we're not playing one of those guys, how do we leverage that? Well, we get double leverage with Dalvin because if we're saying we don't think the high-priced running backs go for 30 plus, well, what if they all go for 15 to 25 and Dalvin goes for 28 to 30? Well, now we gain an edge on all those high-priced running back rosters. And then also if Dalvin goes for, well, I explored this last week, pretty interesting, but 3 of Dalvin's 4 26 to 28 point games, 3 of those 4 games, Justin Jefferson also hit. So we're not necessarily taking away points from Justin Jefferson, but we're either riding up with those Justin Jefferson rosters, or if it's the scenario where Dalvin hits, Jefferson doesn't, which we can certainly paint that picture against Green Bay. Well, now we're taking away points from those Jefferson rosters as well. So really like the Dalvin play for kind of not just in a vacuum. It's a solid play in a vacuum, but it has some really nice strategy angles to it this week, especially if you're watching this and you're kind of with me on like, yeah, I don't know if any of these high price guys will hit. Dalvin becomes a really interesting way to play things.
For sure. Yeah. I like that thought a lot. So that leaves us with 5,500. We're still definitely in range if we wanted to do a Sutton or Judy on this build. Obviously, Judy more expensive. Are there any other one-off plays or blocks or directions you would want to steer this?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to force myself this week to not have like 80% Shark because he does have a broad range of outcomes. But on a roster like this, where I don't have any pieces from that Lions-Bears game, and I feel so confident in that Lions-Bears game being at worst a solid game compared to all the other games on the slate, I want to make sure I get in a piece from there. So putting Shark onto this roster is a great way to go. And then that still leaves us like in this range, right, the 64 to 6,800, people aren't typically comfortable leaving 400 in salary on the table. But when you compare it to what else is here, it's basically, to me, it's like Judy, Etienne, Ramondre, but what fits best with this roster? Judy, right? I would be totally fine taking Judy and leaving that 400 on the table on this build. There's nowhere else where, like, Dalvin, there's nowhere where we spend that salary. Mahomes, McKinnon, Juju, we're not going to break up that. Shark, if we're moving off Shark, we're going up to, I think, Drake London's 4,900, so we can't get up to him. Then so it's like Dotson at 4,600, which doesn't really do anything for us. Shark's a better play, and he's in a better game environment. He's in a game environment we want to bet on. And then Kittle is our leverage off of Kelsey. So there's really nothing that I want to do differently here. I also like having the Kittle 49ers pairing because they can work together, right? The 49ers can hit, Kittle can hit in the same game because we've seen Kittle hitting with low Brock Purdy volume. So that's a pairing most people won't have because it feels unnatural. And so even leaving 400 in salary here, we always want to poke around to see, is there anywhere where we can improve this? But if we're not breaking up our core bet, our initial bet, well, then these other 5 spots, there's nowhere where we're improving our roster by spending that extra 400. And so I really like the way that this roster comes together. Tons of upside, right? Like we saw Mahomes, McKinnon, Juju combined for north of 90 points last time against Denver. We know Kittle can go for 30 plus points. We know Dalvin can go for 30 points. We know Dortch can go for 20 points. We know Shark can go for 20 plus points. We know Judy can go for 20 to 30 points. You know, the 49ers defense can go for 20 points. So just across the board, it's like 20 to 30 pointers available to us here. And we're not betting on any like high risk, like super high risk types of plays here. It's like pretty solid range of outcomes on most of these plays to where if our block hits, all the other plays on this roster are pretty solid plays. Like Judy gets carried up with the block. Dalvin has a pretty good shot at hitting. Dortch has a pretty good shot at hitting the score that we need from him. Shark, Kittle, 49ers defense. So yeah, I mean, it's a great build for any style of tournament as well. Large field, small field, however we wanted to play it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you did want to just bank the highest stuff and you didn't want to force to bring back, you know, Ramondre at 6,800 fits in a pretty nice way there as well. But yeah, I like the Judy angle. And I do like your thought too of it's really hard. It's scary to full fade Chicago, Detroit. So who are the kind of guys that could kind of suck up some points and almost muck up the game? I think Jamal Williams would maybe be another candidate there. Of a guy who could get 2 touchdowns and then Jared Goff doesn't get there, Amon-Ra doesn't get there, I think is interesting as well.
Yeah, and that's the other way to play that game, right? Is to say maybe Williams doesn't win you a tournament, but his price has dropped enough. There will be no ownership on him to where if he goes for 18 points, and then again, these high-priced guys all go for 15 to 25, Dalvin Cook goes for 22. Ramondre, you know, he has a 127-pointer, 125-pointer, a 23-pointer, and everything else below that. Right? Like if Ramondre goes for 18, if Connor goes for 18, all these guys are going to end up in that range. And Jamal Williams scores 17, 18 points. Same thing we said with Zonovan Knight and Algier and these other guys who really can't get you 30, but they can save you some salary and get you 18 to 20 points. Jamal Williams is kind of like that as well, but then he's also taking away points from the really popular Goff rosters this week, Amon-Ra St. Brown rosters. So, he's an interesting play as well, just from a standpoint of strategy and saying, if this slate plays out a particular way and he gets the touchdowns, he actually ends up with a lot of value.
One final kind of bonus thing. I saw this question in the chat, and I thought we could touch on it because we didn't get to that specific block, but someone wanted you to expand on the thought of playing Tyler Algier and Drake London together. I know that one generally throws people off of thinking of them negatively correlated on a play-by-play basis, but I know how much you like those kind of team level correlated bets. Yeah, so
it's interesting because I'll dive into this in the player grid, but the Connor and Dortch are 10.2K. London and Algier are 10.2K in that same game together. So if you played all 4 of them together, it's 20.4K in total salary. And you can easily paint the picture of them going for 80 plus points, right? The thing with London and Algier is that they're both really good plays in a vacuum because of their recent usage. Algier, this is off the top of my head, but I think it's 18 and 17 carries the last 2 games. And then one of those games, he had several receptions. And it seems like the Falcons are basically saying, let's start preparing for next year. Let's see what we have in some of these younger guys. Drake London, 9 targets, 11 targets, and 12 targets in the last 3 games. So same sort of thing, right? Where he's getting the usage. And these guys are getting usage together, right? And so even though neither has hit yet for a big game because the touchdowns haven't been there, well, Drake London's been 5 and 4 yards away from the 100-yard bonus in 2 of his last 3 games. So a few extra yards, his scores look totally different. Add a touchdown to one of those, he's sitting up at like the 25 to 27 point range all of a sudden. And that's not taking away the opportunities for Algier to get a touchdown of his own. So because of how cheap they are, they've both been able to get close to hitting value on their price tags without touchdowns, without 100-yard bonuses. And so the fact that Drake London getting the 100-yard bonus doesn't prevent Algier from getting the 100-yard bonus and vice versa. And if this team scores 3 touchdowns, easily 2 of them could come through these 2 guys. And so just because of how central they are to the offense right now, I'm basically betting on Atlanta just continuing to give Algier and Drake London most of the work. And so you're saying, like, if Atlanta scores 3 or somehow 4 touchdowns, all of a sudden you're getting 2 or 3 touchdowns from these 2 guys because they are most of the offense. So it's a unique way to put it together. Most people don't like doing it. These 2 have been combining for like around 30 points the last couple of weeks. So a little bit under what you would want at their salary. But like I said, they're just like a few yards away, a break away for the touchdown from getting up to like that 40 plus point combined score. So just a fun, unique way to kind of put that game together is playing around with those pairings of the core wide receiver, the core running back on these 2 teams.
I think what you're trying to say, if you want to put it into clickbait, is you found our generation's Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs, and they actually cost half as much as those 2 do.
That's right. Our week 17 generations, yes. Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs, play one or the other on every single roster. Don't quote me on that. And don't send me your screenshots when you lose doing that. But no, I do think and one of the things I said this week is like, again, I got to work through my thoughts now that Colt McCoy's out. But one of the things I said yesterday was I will have more of Connor and Dortch than I will of London and Algier. But I like both sides of this. So the Falcon side is like will be a smaller portion of my builds, but it's still something I'm interested in and we'll have some exposure to.
What else do you guys got going on over on the site these days? It's been a few weeks since we've checked up. You guys always have some deals, some things for people to come over and check it out.
Yeah, we're throwing a big party for Pete being a dad. Pete, you're not invited, but we're going to do it without you. No, we've got, let's see. So next week, we're going to drop the price of rest of season again. I don't know what it'll be dropped to, but right now your best bet is to do the 20% off for a week pass. And then in wildcard week, we're going to make everything free to OWS free members. So if you watch this every week and somehow have not signed up for OWS free yet, you might want to do that because everything will be free to you wildcard weekend. So those are the 2 main things going on right now. And then we'll have some more stuff next week, which we'll see if I'm on the show next week. You got to make a decision on that as Cash Game Pete of whether or not we're cash gaming it together. But if not, I've had an absolute blast doing the show this season. So
I think regardless of next week when I turn into a cash game grinder, I would be happy to get together for maybe a wild card or divisional round slate preview if you wanted to.
I actually don't play DFS in the playoffs ever because
you don't? Okay.
I love the NFL so much that I want to like reward myself with a few weekends of just chilling and watching the game.
Wow, you are actually sick. Watching games without action on it, JM.
But goodness. I will hop on a show and chat about those games if we've got a show coming up for those.
Awesome. Yeah, next week, as everyone knows, week 18, I do turn into a cash game grinder. I will be accepting your head-to-heads. I will only be caring about the best plays, turning off Galaxy Brain mode. So more on that to come. Check out 1 week season. Check out JM. If you guys enjoy the building block element and building lineups, check out that new show over on the 1 week season YouTube and get your daily fix of those kind of building exercises. And then, like I said, I'll be back tonight for a Deposit Kingdom YouTube hang, and we'll get back to a VIP cram on Sunday for you YouTube members. We'll fire one up again. I believe, what do we do that at? 10:30 a.m. Eastern on Sunday. So yeah, we'll walk through the slate with all of the updated news. Appreciate you guys and your patience while I took some time away. It feels good to be back in the saddle. Always good to talk with JM. Good luck this week. We'll see you guys at the top of the leaderboards. Peace.